Dr. Sam Baars is from the Centre for Education and Youth and gave evidence to the Education Committee for this report. Sam, good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Hal. Thanks for having me.
It's good to have you here. What do you think is behind this? And specifically, why do you think there is this disparity between white pupils and ethnic minorities? And I think it's probably important to say, because someone brought this up earlier, and perhaps you can educate me further on this, that kids who are on free school meals, once it gets to degree level, it is a different story to once it gets to GCSE. And you have to make a distinction between that actually white kids on free school meals do better in the job market once they have a degree than black kids.
Yeah, that's broadly true. Essentially, the scale and nature of the problem differs according to the point where you measure it. So you can obviously, young people go through, there's a long period of youth before they become adults, and you can measure these differences when in the early years at primary school, at secondary school. Things get flipped on their head at A level if young people take A levels. And then, as you said, in higher education, the picture gets complicated again. There is plenty of evidence that when you break it down by ethnic background, it's white young people who are on free school meals who do worse. I don't think I would dispute a lot of the data in the report today, but that's not always the case. It can be different depending on how you measure it and when you measure it. And I think that's, for instance, also it depends how you break down ethnic groups and how you talk about and describe them.
With every ethnic group at GCSE, so whether that be Bangladeshi, Black African, Black Afro-Caribbean, Indian, Asian, other, etc., collectively they will do better at their GCSEs than white working class kids on free school meals.
That is the case.
Right. Okay.
At GCSE, that's the case.
Right. Okay.
If you look at exclusions, it's a completely different picture. Look at the proportion of kids coming away with 3 good A levels. It's a completely different picture. Right, and degree classifications that young people get, it's a completely different picture. But yes, I think it's broadly true at GCSE.
Okay. So then, what are the drivers behind this? Because there is a danger, and certain people on social media or certain commentators will try and boil this down and try and simplify it. But it isn't simplistic, is it?
No, it's not. And I think actually you put your finger on the question about parenting, and the evidence and data that I've looked at over the years does point towards parenting as an important factor. But I think this is where language becomes really important, because when we're talking about the parenting as a factor, as you said, it's not about parents not caring. It's about parents knowing what it is they can do to support their kids. And those are 2 completely different things. You can really, really want to do something, but just not have the resources to do it, or not really know how to do it very effectively. I think that's a distinction we can all understand. And that's essentially what's driving the role of parents in all of this. Like, the data suggests that it's white British kids on free school meals tend to have less knowledge about how they can achieve their aspirations, and their parents do as well, than kids from other ethnic backgrounds. And that explains quite a lot of the difference. So parents are a really important factor.
I mean, this is a sociological question, I guess, but is it less easy if you have been here for generations to see what progress looks like than if you perhaps left a village in Pakistan or in India and within a generation your son or daughter is a doctor?
It could be that. This is obviously something I don't have any direct lived experience of, but there's compelling evidence that having a history of relatively recent migration in your family is likely to involve something of, there's often a fair degree of struggle involved there. And also lots of parents who came to the UK in the last 60, 70 years, many of them have experienced that phenomenon where they're actually very well educated and well trained in the country they came from, but they then had to kind of work their way back to that position in the UK because their qualifications aren't recognised or because of institutional racism. And I think that is part of the reason why some parents might have a clear idea of what it is you can achieve if you work really hard at something. But I don't think that explains all of it.
Interesting that you made that distinction about parents caring but not having sufficient means. Because again, the lazy stereotyping of parents who don't care is not helpful to this conversation, presumably.
Yeah, I'd agree. You can look back to data on when kids are really, really young, and across the spectrum of social class and ethnicity, broadly the same proportion of parents want their kids, for instance, to go to university. Obviously, that's not like a universal goal for all parents or young people, but it's seen as a bit of a benchmark. And when you measure it that way, most parents want that to be the case. But interesting things happen often when kids start secondary school. That's a bit of a cliff edge for lots of groups. It's a real cliff edge, for instance, for Black Caribbean boys whose progress and attainment, it literally drops off a cliff, even those who come in doing really well at the end of primary. But it's also a bit of a cliff edge for aspirations, and young people, particularly those who are white British by background, their aspirations often start high, but for some reason, they really do start to kind of fall off a cliff edge at secondary school. So I think when kids move to secondary school is a really important point to look at.
What difference did Sure Start centres make towards education? Is there a link at all between Sure Starts, which I know over a decade lost 2/3 of their funding? Has there been any research into the benefits or not of Sure Start centres?
There has, and I think it's broadly positive. And it's interesting to see that the report today, from a very different kind of government, I think, in many ways, is essentially calling for what they call, hubs of integrated services, which was pretty much what Sure Start was. Times have changed, things have moved on. I don't think we necessarily want the same policy levers that may have worked 20 years ago. Also, Sure Start, our ability to measure how successful Sure Start centres were is confounded a little bit by the fact that lots of middle-class people made use of them, which is no bad thing. But to some extent, there was crowding out of the people who would have most benefited from using those services, because the irony is that it's often sharp-elbowed middle-class parents who are best at making use of public services. But I do think Sure Start centres were effective. And I think nowadays the language has moved on. We talk about integrated services, but there are more and more schools realising that actually schools can't do everything. And we have the most success with young people when we provide them with a good education, but we also make sure, potentially under the same single roof, that their physical health is taken care of, that they have good mental health or they're supported with mental health problems, and that parents have the ability to continue learning lifelong. All of these things can support young people's attainment. And I think we are seeing a really encouraging return to that kind of thinking.
Well, the Institute for Fiscal Studies did actually do, they did evaluate the health effects of Sure Start, didn't they? And they say it was saving the NHS hundreds of millions of pounds. Yeah, so that's just the health benefits of Sure Start, let alone the educational benefits. Yeah. So, I mean, look, I feel like I've had this conversation before, Sam, right? That this isn't a new conversation. And politicians do like to, from time to time, wring their hands and say, woe is me, and good grief, this is a big issue. But can we chart any progress that has been made in this conversation? Otherwise, I feel like I'm having a bit of a Groundhog Day here as a presenter.
Yeah, I can imagine you've spoken about it a lot. And this report refers to previous education committees that have produced very similar reports over the years. Sometimes people talk about this as a forgotten group. You can find that word in the title of this report, and I would dispute that, because actually I don't think they've been forgotten.
No, they haven't.
Education secretaries have been talking about this group of young people since the early 90s. But what I think is more true is that we haven't made as much progress with this group and other groups too, that as we may have wanted to. Reports on the progress of pupils from other ethnic backgrounds often speaks of there's been progress, but if everyone's progressing equally, then gaps can still persist. So there's a bit of a distinction here. I think that often this debate becomes polarized between people who think that essentially, people who make the case that if all young people are provided with the same opportunities, then they will all go on to essentially kind of converge around, a common decent.
But equality of opportunity does not equal equality of outcome, does it?
Right, it doesn't. And I think this report makes the case that white privilege is an unhelpful discourse. I think it's an important discourse, but it doesn't have to mean that all white people are privileged. But I think, for instance, that the essentially racist barriers that lots of young people from other ethnic groups have to face consistently do hold them back. They can still do well, and they may on average do better than white British pupils, but it doesn't mean that there isn't such a thing as white privilege. Likewise, young people growing up in certain areas of the country, I've done lots of research on outer urban areas, so the edges of cities and towns, are often furthest away from either the affluence that you find if you go a bit further out, or the opportunities that you find if you go a bit further in. And the idea of kind of geographical inequality, the way our economy works, the way we have these big concentrations, whether it's London or the Northern Powerhouse, for instance, we run the risk of just creating another tight-knit centre of economic activity, which then rapidly depletes when you come out of Manchester. And it's young people growing up in those sorts of areas. The situation you find them in is essentially the same as one that you could have found decades ago. And it's those geographical inequalities too that I think are really stubborn. So we have made progress. It's frustrating when people say we've made no progress. I think there has been progress, but it's been really slow.
Yes, and against the backdrop of austerity, of course.
I think that's contributed. It's certainly contributed. I mean, child poverty, the report says that child poverty isn't the sole explanation. That doesn't mean it's not a big part of the explanation. I think it is a big part of the explanation. And the data on child poverty is pointing now in entirely the wrong direction. After years of slow but measurable progress against the target to reduce or eradicate child poverty, we're now going in the wrong direction. And that's, you can inject a small current flowing one way, but if the tide is working against you, then you're not really going to have much impact.
Fascinating. The way this has been reported, the certain words that have been used, Sam, how do you feel now about your own contribution and then the result of it?
I don't feature heavily in the reports. The work of my organisation, the Centre for Education and Youth, does, and I think where we're cited, we're happy to be, and that it's in support of the sorts of policies or calls for policies that you've just been describing in detail. So, for instance, kind of placing more emphasis on adult education, levelling up school funding. I think school funding is a real problem. There's evidence that essentially in the last few years or the last decade or so, deprivation has become less of a kind of inner urban thing and more of an outer urban thing. But school funding hasn't necessarily followed that. So we're in a situation now where some of the most deprived schools that need the most funding aren't getting it. But we've called for that to change, and it looks like it will change. I agree that it's a really a slightly puzzling report in that I think it gets some key things wrong, like the line against a white privilege discourse, but it gets so many things right as well. Lots of the policy claims are things that we would wholeheartedly support. And I think there is a real earnest commitment to reforming key planks of government policy and education, like pupil premium, how much we give in pupil premium, but also how we allocate it. So it genuinely goes to kids who've been on free school meals for their whole life, rather than those who've maybe briefly dipped into school meals and who need that top-up funding less. There's some quite big thinking in the report, and we really welcome that.
Sam, thank you for joining us this afternoon. Dr. Sam Baars there from the Centre for Education and Youth.
Dr. Sam Baars is Director of Research and Operations at the think tank, the Centre for Education and Youth. He's been researching educational experiences of white working class boys for the past 10 years and gave oral evidence to the Education Committee. Good evening.
Good evening.
Dr. Baars, this report clearly, Dr. Robert Halfon clearly thinks poverty is not enough of a reason to explain this disparity. Where would you begin?
I think he's broadly right. I think, as always, the issue is more complex than that, and I think the report does a good job of drawing attention to that. I don't think we want to downplay the importance of poverty. I think, in fact, it's probably one of the most important factors. But the other important aspects of this that I would argue for is essentially one of intersectionality. So poverty means or has a different impact on different groups of young people. So across the board, in general, social class and poverty, that there's a gradient to those across all different ethnic groups. So in general, all young people from working class backgrounds tend to do worse than their peers from the same ethnic group, but who are middle class. but that gradient does look slightly different. So poverty has the same impact in general, but it seems to have more of an impact for white British young people. And I think to that extent, I would agree with the report.
So in your view, is this more about the white or more about the disadvantage of the affected children?
I don't think it's about being white. The report is quite strident in its critique of the idea of white privilege, and I think that's mistaken. I think it's based on a slightly confused...
It sees it as a negative term, and one which, in a sense, doesn't describe the experience of those who are white and poor.
Sure, and I think the report is right to say that many people balk at the term white privileged, and there are many white young people across the country who wouldn't see themselves as privileged. That's different to the fact, in my view, that there is such a thing as white privilege. So underlying all of this,
even if you're a poor working class child in a relatively poor area, growing up in a poor area.
Yes, I think your whiteness won't be the thing that's working against you, despite the fact that there will be dozens of other things that are working against you. So you can certainly be a disadvantaged pupil if you're white, but your whiteness won't be contributing to that disadvantage. You know, for instance, you're not having to experience daily forms of racism that your peers might be having to. But that's not to say that you can't be disadvantaged if you're white.
So in your view, then, what do you think needs to be done about these educational disparities? Everyone seems to agree that they exist. The report says there's been decades of muddled thinking. What could the solution be?
So I think the report does a good job of kind of injecting some fresh energy into what's really quite a long-running debate. I don't think this is a forgotten group. We've been talking about them for a while, but I do agree that we haven't made much progress. As you know, you could say the same for other groups such as young people with special educational needs and disabilities, other groups that we've long been talking about but haven't really cracked the nut of their performance in the education system. Something I think is really positive in this report is the focus on the role of neighbourhoods. My own research has flagged the importance of kind of urban peripheries. So moving on from this notion of inner urban deprivation and looking at the challenges that communities face that are on the edges of small cities and towns across the country. So it's not about the regions, it's something more granular than that. And we know that young people growing up on the edge of cities who do tend to be white are far less likely to aspire to high-skilled jobs. Their attainment tends to be lower.
But what's the solution to that? Briefly.
Something that's interesting in this report is that actually one of the key policy solutions might be kind of integrated, what we call integrated services. So bringing a range of provision at a community level and into a single hub. Okay. So that might be supporting young people's mental health, their physical health. And we were already doing this 20 years ago, but it's positive to see this report kind of speaking to those kind of solutions again.
Dr. Sam Baars, thanks very much.
Let me bring Sam into the conversation. Sam, morning.
Morning, thanks for having me.
No, pleasure. So you're the Director of Research at the Centre for Education and Youth?
Yes.
Okay, so just break down what you make of our question today with some context as well, please.
Sure. So I think the first thing, and the report draws attention to this today, that, or in general, all young people from a working class background or a poor background, those two things generally run together, tend to do worse than their more affluent peers from the same ethnic background. So that's kind of, there's like a downward slope basically based on social class. And that's true for young people from all ethnic groups, but some lines are steeper than others. And it looks like it's part of the reason that white British pupils who are on free school meals come bottom of the pile on some measures. That's how they do at school. It's because that line is steeper. So there's a much bigger gap for those pupils than there is for some other groups in terms of...
Yeah. No, so I'm just going to jump in and say, in terms of, we were talking about white privilege there, and but it doesn't mean that all white people are privileged, and it's important to sort of make that distinction, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. I would disagree with the report's line that white privilege doesn't exist. I think it's certainly, for some people, it's a difficult discourse to engage with, but I don't think that's at all a reason not to use the discourse. I think white privilege does exist. And it was really, so interesting listening to that discussion previously. All the small day-to-day experiences from other people from other ethnic groups, kind of, that's tangible lived experience of what white privilege feels like. But that doesn't mean that all white people are going to either feel privileged or are privileged objectively. There's lots of white young people growing up in relatively poorer parts of the country, and they aren't in a privileged position, but it's not their whiteness that is disadvantaging them.
And then equally, the distinction can be made amongst Asian students as well. It can be quite a broad thing to say that all Asian students are doing well or are extremely academic. But then if you break that down into different groups, then you can see that Indian students will do far better than Bangladeshi students, for example, based on statistics.
Yeah, that's broadly true. And although we're focusing on, like this report focuses primarily on what we call disadvantaged or working class or poorer students, there's quite a range of terms we use to describe. But I think it's also interesting to look at pupils who are relatively more advantaged, and actually we don't see a kind of a payoff for more advantaged students from Indian, Pakistani, Bangladeshi backgrounds in terms of how they do at school. They're actually kind of dramatically outperformed by white British students. So it's a really complicated debate, and some of it's also not people do at school. I think something that we have made the case for at the Centre for Education and Youth is research which shows that even, for instance, Muslim women who do really well at school, they struggle to translate their educational success into labour market success. Not always, but often they're less likely to translate great grades at school and at A-level into highly paid or highly skilled careers. So it's also not just about how young people do at school.